coalition forms against the Islamic State as a summit kicks off in Paris with leaders of more than 30 countries gathered to discuss how to fight the militant group. United Nations peacekeepers withdraw their forces from the Syrian side of the Golan Heights as rebel fighters take more territory in the Quneitra province, and the Syrian military responds with airstrikes. 1,300 troops from 15 nations, including 200 U.S. soldiers, hold a military training exercise in western Ukraine. Meanwhile, clashes continue in the east, mostly around the city of Donetsk, despite the ceasefire.
The News Today with David Matlin.
Hello and welcome to the program today. In Paris, now is playing host to the summit of over 30 nations gathered to establish the strategy against the Islamic State. Well, major statements were delivered. French President François Hollande called for a global response. NATO's chief stated that the threat requires military action. While together, world leaders pledged support for the Iraqi government. Meanwhile, Iran, while not physically present, was a topic of conversation, with Ayatollah Khamenei making clear his country would not cooperate with America's quote-unquote polluted hands. We'll go to our analyst Christian Maillard in Paris, who's covering the events of the conference there today. But first, a look back at the day's events.
Nous devons nous engager ensemble, et c'est le sens de cette conférence, aux côtés des autorités irakiennes, clairement, loyalement et fortement.
مارس تنظيم داعش خلال هذه الأشهر جرائم إبادة جماعية وجرائم تطهير عرقي وديني ضد الآلاف من المواطنين.
Le combat des Irakiens contre les terroristes est donc aussi le nôtre.
With me tonight on set is Professor Yossi Shea, an international politics expert at Georgetown and Tel Aviv University, and Dr. Brandon Friedman from the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Professor Shea, first of all, as this conference is underway now in Paris, a high-profile event, what do you see really coming out of such a summit?
First of all, I think it's very interesting posture when the international system is coming together, especially in the Middle East, after many months or perhaps years, which you could not really summon people together because of the divisions, because of the divisiveness, because of the different tracks that countries went alone, and because of the American reluctance, perhaps, to be engaged. Now they found a common enemy. To what extent this common enemy really will unite all these groups, and whether they will really assert themselves and contribute to the effort to dismantle the ISIL is a different story. But nevertheless, is a very interesting moment in international affairs, because we needed really something that will bring people together, and before that we didn't have this kind of like element. And this element of extremism could really bring Arabs, non-Arabs, various streams in the international system, including the Russians, including the Americans, and I even saw the Syrian foreign minister speaking, which is quite interesting.
Now, there's been a lot of positive talk about this coalition, how it's being structured. John Kerry, U.S. president, also issuing very optimistic statements now about how this is coming along. At the same time, a lot of emphasis on the Arab partners in this coalition. But it's been vague on the details now about what they'll do, how they'll participate. Do you have any idea, or how do you think the Arab countries will ultimately get involved?
Professor Shane, and others are clearly seeing the glass as half full. In terms of the Middle East, I would tend to see it as half empty. I think it's a coalition of the unwilling. I think clearly Jordan is more concerned about its own internal security than it is about defeating the Islamic State in either Syria or Iraq. I think, moreover, Saudi Arabia is in a bind. On one hand, it clearly sees the Islamic State as a threat to its own security. On the other hand, it also understands that the Islamic State has a great deal of support internally in terms of Saudi Arabia. And if Saudi Arabia would be proactive about going out and trying to defeat the Islamic State, they would potentially face an internal security situation. And so what you have is really a lot of a positive energy, perhaps, coalescing around the U.S. effort to put together a coalition. But I think right now is what you have in reality is a lot of reluctant partners. And if there are two parties that are eager to get into the fight, it's Bashar al-Assad and Iran, and they stand to win. So the U.S. is crafting a strategy that, in fact, if you ask me, stands to benefit the very groups that the U.S. doesn't want to benefit, which are Bashar al-Assad and the state formerly known as Syria and Iran.
Do you agree with that, if you will, a prediction that these Arab states really only have a half interest in going into this fight against the Islamic State militants?
Surprisingly, I will agree with some comments were made here. One is, of course, the reluctance. Even the Americans are entering this with some reluctance because it's not full speed ahead. It's rather very tepid. And the president announced that he will do as much in terms of attacking the ISIL and in terms of being on the ground. And therefore, he needs this coalition, understanding that only bombing from the air will not do the job. Second, of course, is the commitment that we are here. And every state, every actor in the Middle East has its own interest. I mentioned that we see the Syrians. Of course, the Syrians, whom the Americans are considering illegitimate and also a target while arming their opposition, would love to be suddenly as a legitimate player within the international coalition. And others, of course, want to be there for other reasons. This is the complexity that we are here, and therefore this kind of unity, or this kind of like pictures of unity, just show us one thing, though, that there is a concern, and the concern, notwithstanding the differences of opinion and notwithstanding the different interests, are showing that something is really extreme has happened in the Middle East that threaten the system and also that cause havoc within states and in the Islamic world. What are these people doing and on whose behalf? This is a very big question that will come to haunt the Arab and the Islamic world even further than Al-Qaeda did.
Can you see that countries like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, can even get involved militarily in such a coalition? Or is this too complicated for them?
I don't think the Saudis are. I don't think it's too complicated for them. I just don't think they see it as in their interest to get into the fight. Now, the United Arab Emirates, and there have been reports of others have offered to fly airstrikes along with the U.S. to show that they are willing to put some skin in the game in terms of military operations. But I think what it comes down to is really this. And, the groups that are going to be fighting the Islamic State in Iraq, in Syria, are they really capable? Is there going to be, what we're talking about here is people willing to help, willing to participate in the fight. But when it comes down to it, in order to defeat the Islamic State, which I presume is the objective here, you have to have some degree of coordination. And it seems to me that the only force capable of fighting in a coordinated fashion against the Islamic State is going to be the Americans. And so, yeah, there's talk about the Shia militias that are supported by Iran. There's talk about the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Syrian Kurds. There's talk about the Sunni moderates and having their force trained in Saudi Arabia. But at the end of the day, who's going to coordinate all of those different forces? And the coordination is critical. The reason the Islamic State has been able to succeed is, frankly, they've been much more coordinated against weaker enemies. This is not a huge, 1,000-pound gorilla. Sure, they've proven that they have certain ability to fight in a coordinated professional fashion, but they can be defeated if they face an organized, determined opposition. The question is whether that opposition exists, whether it will materialize under American leadership, and frankly, whether the Americans are willing to make the commitment in order to see it through.
We'll continue to discuss this, but Shai Ben Aria, correspondent, looked at some of the headlines out of the opening of the Paris conference today.
Representatives from 30 countries convened in Paris Monday for an international conference devoted to countering what has come to be considered one of the greatest threats facing civilized societies around the globe: the rise of the Islamic State terrorist group.
Le combat des Irakiens contre les
The
terroristes.
fight of the Iraqi people against terrorists is ours as well, and we have to act together. And this is the whole purpose of this conference. We have to stand by the Iraqi authorities clearly, loyally, and strongly. And there's not a moment to be lost.
Et fortement.
Foreign ministers and other high-level officials from the 5 Permanent Security Council members, as well as key Arab states like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, all attended. Significantly, a number of the Arab countries agreed to contribute to further airstrikes against Islamic State forces.
We're asking for airborne operations to be continued regularly against terrorist sites. We must not allow them to set up sanctuaries. We must pursue them wherever they are. We must cut off their financing. We must besiege them with laws that forbid people to work with them.
There are indeed many tasks on the agenda, and the Paris conference was called to help define the role of each contributing nation. The U.S., however, ruled out the participation of both Iran and Syria in the conference, though both countries are also concerned with the rise of IS. The Iranians themselves responded saying they weren't interested in cooperating with the U.S., whose, quote, hands are polluted.
In the last few days, we've had some excitement, and with that excitement, we've been hearing from American officials making comments on forming a coalition, which are blank, hollow, and self-serving, and lacking any direction.
Turkey is a somewhat reluctant partner in this coalition, stressing it would only allow humanitarian and logistical operations from the NATO air base located in its territory. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said the White House was not yet seeking commitments for ground forces from any of its international partners. Whether this will be enough to uproot the Islamic State remains to be seen.
Now with me from Paris is I-24 News international analyst Christian Maillard. Thank you for joining us. Now, does it look like anything concrete has been achieved yet out of this conference in Paris?
Well, I would say, David, that there has been a lot of talks for no concrete steps taken officially. Let's put it this way. I think the 26 delegations really wanted to emphasize upon the fact that we need to strengthen the unity, the integrity, and the sovereignty of Iraq, and at the same time to step up the military attacks on Daesh and cutting off their financial sources. But the key question, which has not been answered, is can we target Daesh in Syria? And there we need to get the answer. What about Russia and Iran? Which are the supporters of Bashar al-Assad? Can we take the risk of strengthening Bashar al-Assad's power? This is all the question, and we have to wait in the coming days and weeks what's going to happen.
Well, there seems to be a lot of debate on Iran's involvement there. How much was that discussed?
Well, discussion about Iran took place before the conference of today, because you know that the United States have been exerted pressures by Saudi Arabia, which is not a friend of Iran, and by other United Arab Emirates country. And so it is a difficulty that for Iran to be part of the coalition, because we don't trust Iran. But at the same time, we cannot get rid of Iran and Russia, which are key partners to Bashar al-Assad, and without their, let's say, their help or their yes to go, we might have problems, because definitely these two countries remain a force of nuisance.
Well, thank you for that report, Christian Maillard from Paris. Now, Professor Shane, it's been reported today that Arab countries, as part of this coalition, are ready to take, quote-unquote, kinetic action against ISIS. What can that mean now out of these countries?
First of all, there is a very interesting case here. You can see that suddenly the collapse of the Arab state system bring the Arabs really to go back to the colonialist to ask for the restoration of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, to ask basically for support to retain and maintain their boundaries. This is fascinating. What we have here is really Arabs are basically telling other Arabs, get with the program. We can no longer play double game like with Qatar. Qatar had to expel the Muslim Brothers leaders from its home, or some of them, because to the chagrin of the Saudis and of course to the Egyptians in the last few months. It also telling the European states that they have to be involved much more in the Middle East and cannot disconnect, or the Americans could not disconnect as they wished, because this issue comes to their shores. That is, we have these foreign fighters, and they know that they will come back home, or they are going to the arena. So there are lots, as we said before, lots of interests are involved here, and perhaps the Russians, representing the Syrians in some ways, asking the system to be maintained, and perhaps this is how they will kind of like continue to keep the status quo in Syria. So what we have here, as we indicated before, is a game of many to say, look, we are legitimate. there is some degree of legitimacy against these illegitimate actions. Those who are seeking legitimacy are themselves, to some extent, felt that the rug is being pushed under their feet, and they're trying to get back to the game, including, of course, the Iraqi government, which is trying to consolidate with the Americans and establish itself afresh. We will see how this all evolved and to what extent they will be able to contain these forces in Syria and Iraq.
Now, another player mentioned here, as we just saw in this report, Turkey, sharing a border with this situation now, and a NATO ally. One might expect Turkey to be more willing to be active militarily, but so far it seems that they don't want to take that step. Why is that? What are you reading from Turkey?
I don't think they want to be stung by the scorpion's tail. To some degree, the Islamic State has been created by the highway Turkey has created to allow these jihadists to transit through on their way to fight. The foreign fighters...
To fight the Assad regime in Syria.
Professor Shane was referring to the foreign fighters that have come basically from, the four corners of the earth to fight in Syria, have gone through Turkey.
Many of them, yes.
And this has allowed Turkey to remain basically, outside of the Islamic State's target. And so I think when I look at the situation, I look how Turkey is playing this game. Turkey also, frankly, doesn't see itself, as being, part of this Western system. Erdogan has sort of turned away. You see Erdogan facing Russia, and he looks to someone like Putin. And I think people in Turkey almost talk about a Putinization of Turkey under Erdogan. And you begin to wonder, how willing they are to cooperate. There's a lot of lip service paid to cooperating with the Americans, but when you look at practical measures, Turkey's said no to the Americans in 2003, now again to use their territory to fight the Islamic State. They've offered humanitarian assistance, but that's in their own interest because they have millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey. So, when you look at this story, it's absolutely complex. There are many, many interests involved.
Does Turkey find themselves now having some common interests strategically with the Assad regime now?
Maybe if I may interject one word, it's interesting because if we see the Arab states, the stable, so to speak, stable, Sisi, the Saudis, the Jordanians for that matter, trying to maintain and perhaps to perpetuate the Sykes-Picot agreement, the Turkey maybe is not interested in that agreement. That agreement, of course, symbolized the collapse of the old Ottoman Empire, while Erdogan is trying to some degree, I don't know if to reconstruct it, but certainly to bring Turkey to a greater role and not to put Turkey in its place. So Turkey lost lots of ground in the Middle East, especially in Egypt and in of course in Gaza and other places, and it's trying to say we will not be again playing the Western game because the West did not accept Turkey. Of course, Europeans did not accept Turkey. So as suggested before, Turkey is trying again to play double game. But double games may come to haunt Turkey just as they come to haunt Qatar. Qatar two-faced policy, on the one hand, being part of the West and having the Americans in Qatar. On the other hand, kind of like telling the radicals, we are with you one way or another, is perhaps, I don't know if over, but it's becoming more and more difficult.
Can we read what Qatar wants now or how they would plan on being involved, or is that too hard to decipher?
No, I think it's quite clear. Qatar's wanted what they've always wanted, which is to survive. The Al Thani want to continue to rule a very wealthy state that they have, and so they've tried to be all things to all people, and what they're finding is you can't have your cake and eat it too. And so, by the way, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who still has a base in Qatar, yes. He wasn't one of the Muslim Brotherhood figures who chose to leave Qatar for Turkey, and some reports say the Sudan. Qaradawi has condemned the American action against the Islamic State. He's also condemned the Islamic State, but he considers the American-led coalition and attack on the Islamic State as being illegitimate. And he's based in Qatar. So clearly Qatar's going to continue to try to play its game. It believes that it differentiates itself within the Gulf. It keeps itself away from Saudi domination. It creates a unique identity. Up until recently, it was seen as being a very constructive, important player in the international system, and that to some degree has given it external legitimacy. And so I think that Qatar's game is quite transparent. I agree with Professor Shane that more and more, the mask or the curtain is being drawn back on the game that Qatar's trying to play, and I think it's going to force them to walk a straighter line.
Let's talk about this exclusion from the coalition of Iran now, on both sides, issuing comments of no, neither wants each other to be involved. Can Iran be denied as a critical player here? They've already shown their willingness to put boots on the ground in Iraq. Many weapons and supply shipments have been flying into Baghdad for a while now, since the beginning of this unrest. How can they be excluded from this attack on ISIS?
You see, like any coalition, if it's almost like domestic politics. You cannot have it too big. You cannot have everybody in, because then everybody will eat everybody. And that is, Iran is beyond the pale. It's certainly beyond the pale in Washington still. So since Iran cannot be inside, the question is how much damage can it cause? Iran itself is being threatened by all these, so Iran certainly has an interest. But Iran is also losing its allies in the Middle East to some extent. And these allies, especially Hezbollah, who are, of course, are still allies of Iran in Syria, are not part of this coalition. They are sort of like wanting to enjoy this coalition, but are not part of this coalition. This will be the game. How much we can benefit from coalition that we do not approve, and to what extent it will do our job. This will be a test. And right now, the Americans cannot allow themselves to bring Iran, because the cost of having Iran on the other side on the nuclear issue is too high, and the benefit is very doubtful.
Iran is well positioned to benefit from what's going on here. I almost, and if you follow the events on the ground in Iraq and Syria closely, what you see is there is a convergence. I wouldn't call it a coordination, I wouldn't call it an alliance, but clearly the Shia militias that are fighting against the Islamic State and the American special forces that are on the ground and the American airstrikes that have been going on for the past few weeks, you do see there has to be some kind of intelligence sharing going on, because clearly what you see happening, if you follow the events closely enough, is that there is a coordinated effort to attack the Islamic State. And if that in fact is happening, what you're hearing on TV from statements out of Iran, statements from the U.S. Department of State, in fact, it reminds me of two partners that are interested in each other who are flirting with one another in a sense. They're both saying, oh, no, nothing's happening. But really what we see happening, if you watch things on the ground, is there does seem to be a convergence of interest. The issue seems to be Bashar al-Assad. The Americans, and particularly the Obama administration, seem to be taking a firm stance in the sense that they will not cooperate with Assad's regime, who has killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians. Otherwise, I think you might see a little bit more open coordination between Iran and the U.S. And I think that's a fairly unfortunate development in this whole thing.
Certainly doesn't play to the strategy of any Western coalition. But first, we asked Israelis on the street today, as this Paris conference against the Islamic State is underway, should Iran be part of the coalition?
Iran can participate in the war. However, we are in a war with Iran, so I don't see a reason to form an alliance with a country on one issue when you want to blow it up because of another issue.
It doesn't seem right to me. Iran has their own agenda in the Middle East, and because of the situation with the ISIS and the American trying to form a coalition, Iran do not belong there.
Now, if you look at the stuff morally, so of course, you can say they are like, they also support terrorism and stuff on the other side. But then again, it's international politics, so morality, I don't think it's so relevant. But personal opinion.
Well, I think it would be awesome, definitely. Also because it would mean that some Arab countries are fighting in the same direction, for example, as Israel does. So it's a part of a Western kind of direction. So I think it would be good, definitely.
It's important to get Iran to join the coalition so we can have as much cooperation as possible.
Unfortunately, in the Middle East, we learned that the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend. I wouldn't add Iran to the coalition.
Well, certainly no shortage of opinions from the Israeli street there.
It's quite fascinating because you see, look at this. This is a very complex situation. And wants the common citizen to understand the complexities, and they're like really expressing opinions which are very, reflecting the really deep understanding of the situation. This situation is not having sort of like the coalition of the willing, or it's not the first Gulf War when the Americans could assemble as the dominating power in the world against a very clear target, Saddam Hussein against Kuwait, or even
91, yes,
or even after September 11, sort of like the axis of evil. This is something which is much more complex. It relates to a very sort of like, I would say, cultural issue on the one hand. It relates to the demarcation of boundaries on the other hand. So it requires really different answers, especially in light of the schism that exists in the Middle East and the changes that took place following the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring. So this is a very, very complex situation, and I'm quite impressed by answers decisions go, because not always we as experts have better answers.
Well, speaking of that, and getting deeper into this now, we look at the possibility that U.S. airstrikes, and for now, again, the United States seems to be the only country able or willing to put direct military power into the situation. We're seeing a situation where the U.S. could be providing air support to Shiite militias slaughtering Sunnis in Iraq, or to, if it expands to Syria, airstrikes against the Islamic State militants that could benefit the Assad regime. Where does the U.S., how can they possibly navigate that? How can they draw a line?
It's been happening. And frankly, I think it's unavoidable if the U.S. is not willing to put more troops on the ground. I mean, and clearly Obama has stated that he doesn't want to. So if that's the case, you have to fight with the forces on the ground. And in Iraq, the forces on the ground today that are fighting are the Iraqi Shia militias supported by Iran, and the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds. Those are the groups the U.S. has to work with in Iraq. In Syria, it's much more tricky. In Syria, what you have is a patchwork, a quilt of all of these so-called moderate Sunni groups that the U.S. is apparently going to try to train and bring together to fight the Islamic State. This is an almost insurmountable challenge. When I look around and I see all of the analysts talking about how this can happen and whether it can happen, it really makes me wonder whether this is an achievable goal. And if in fact you can't train and arm successfully these Sunni moderates to fight the Islamic State in Syria, then who are you relying on? Clearly, they've tried to exclude Bashar al-Assad. So the question remains, what's going to happen in Syria? And I have yet to hear a realistic plan or an effective plan for achieving the kind of result the U.S. is hoping to achieve there.
Are there any moderates left to support in Syria?
This is a very good question. But we have here a policy, as indicated before, that basically stated that Assad is no longer in the game. There were voices that were thinking that Assad is perhaps what we call the known evil, and will have somehow to continue and support Assad or maintaining power. The United States made it clear, and Obama made it clear.
No support for Assad.
No support for Assad.
Unfortunately, out of time, Professor Yossi Shein, thank you very much for being here. Dr. Brendan Friedman, again, thank you both for joining us tonight on our program. We'll be back after a short break. Coalition forms against the Islamic State as a summit kicks off in Paris with the leaders of more than 30 countries gathered to discuss how to fight the militant group. United Nations peacekeepers withdraw their forces from the Syrian side of the Golan Heights as rebel fighters take more territory in the Quneitra province, and the Syrian military responds with airstrikes. And 1,300 troops from 15 nations, including 200 U.S. soldiers, hold a military training exercise in western Ukraine. Meanwhile, clashes continue in the east, mostly around the city of Donetsk, despite the ceasefire. Welcome back to the program here. As we mentioned, despite everything taking place in Syria now, or in coordination with it, United Nations peacekeepers are withdrawing their forces from the Syrian side of the Golan Heights as rebel fighters, including al-Qaeda affiliates, take more territory in the Quneitra province, and the Syrian military has responded with increasing airstrikes. Now, with me on set is senior Middle East analyst Ali Waqid. Ali, thank you for joining us. So what do we know now about the status of forces on the other side of the Israeli border in Syria on the Golan Heights? There's been various reports recently about who's in control.
As you said, David, most of the border territories between Israel and Syria are under the control of the different rebels group. But let's make no mistake, most of these territories are controlled by a jihadist group or groups, as you mentioned, affiliated to al-Qaeda, the al-Nusra Front, the Islamic Front, the grandsons of the Prophet, etc., numerous jihadist organizations, and the Syrian army, who is trying trying to rescue the situation, who is strengthening the strikes against these groups. And in the large context of what is happening in Paris, this conference against the Islamic State, on one hand, the Syrian regime are sending a message that we are also fighting against terrorist group, and on the other hand, the Syrians are well worried from the fact that elements in this coalition are calling to support the rebels in Syria, to support the opposition in Syria, and this borders is very important. We know that most of the border region between Syria and Turkey are controlled by the rebels. Now we are talking also about the borders between Israel and Syria. Same for the borders with Jordan, who are most of them under control of the jihadist group. And we know that the campaign against Daesh will be focused on the region between Syria and Iraq. The Syrian army and the Syrian regime doesn't want to be controlling the center of Syria, while the whole borders of the country are under the control or of jihadist group or of countries and states who are hostile to the regime, like Turkey, Jordan, Israel, and the West.
Let's talk about the United Nations now and their peacekeepers who are there under a mandate to monitor the ceasefire now, a 40-year ceasefire between Syria and Israel, albeit they don't have a mandate to be involved in what's taking place in Syria. But their complete withdrawal from this region now, what does that mean? And does that just give the Syrian army perhaps a freer hand up there?
It means that the UN are raising a white flag, not a blue flag, saying that this is too much to be tough for the troops on the ground, the international troops, the Fijians group and other groups. But it is a sign that an escalation, a very serious escalation, is expected to be taking place in this zone. As I said, the Syrian regime is preparing a counterattack, a counteroffensive in that region, and we should see what would be the reaction of Israel if some of this fire
spills over.
Exactly.
Ali Waqid, as usual, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Well, now, more than 3 million people have fled Syria since the uprising against President Bashar al-Assad's regime began in March 2011. In their host countries, they deal with constant abuse and revenge attacks. Well, I-24 News correspondent Shahar Pellet has more.
As you're watching this report, it is very likely that at this moment another refuge-seeking family is crossing the Syrian border to find shelter in nearby countries. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, Syria had become the biggest humanitarian emergency of our era. A report issued last month details how, in the past year alone, 1 million people joined the exodus of over 3 million Syrians, with hundreds joining them on a daily basis.
We couldn't take it anymore. From being hungry to being cold, being under siege, being bombarded all the time. We saw people die in front of our eyes because of the bombing from both sides. We could no longer stay in Syria.
The bulk of the refugees in the region are now in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. This sudden influx has dramatic political, social and economic consequences for host countries. Lebanon's population, for example, has increased by more than 25% and Jordan's by about 10%.
We are doing the best we can. The programs are ongoing, and we will continue to advocate for more support to neighboring countries, especially Lebanon, because there is a true need for financial support and burden sharing with a country that small accommodating this big a number of refugees.
Some of the outcomes are horrendous. With limited access to work, the refugees' financial situation is often precarious, pushing many to risk everything to get to Europe. Fears of abuse grow as an increasing number of women who fled the fighting are opting to marry wealthier Turkish men, many out of sheer desperation. Meanwhile, more than 60,000 babies have been born to Syrian refugee families living in Turkey since the unrest broke out. And in Lebanon, the refugees are often victims of revenge attacks following recent Islamic State beheadings of Lebanese soldiers in cross-border raids. Some 20% of all refugees live in camps, and unless the job market opens up to them, they're likely to remain in tents and face increasing difficulties, with no apparent end of the conflict to light up the dark tunnel.
Well, now, in the first criminal proceedings in Germany involving the Islamic State, an alleged German jihadist went on trial today, accused of fighting with the group in Syria. The 20-year-old defendant was born near Frankfurt to a family from Kosovo and could face 10 years in prison if convicted. The trial begins as European governments are calling for tougher action to prevent attacks in Europe by radical citizens returning home after gaining weapons and combat experience. And elsewhere, Egyptian officials said today that they'll hunt down the Muslim brothers that were ousted from Qatar and bring them to trial. Well, the emirate had expelled several members of the Muslim Brotherhood following pressures from Gulf Arab states. Well, Ayman Siksek looks at the changing relationships between the wealthy Arab regimes in the Middle East.
An Egyptian leader of the Muslim Brotherhood said 7 of its members had been asked to leave Qatar after the emirate came under pressure to distance itself from the group. Qatar had reportedly been pressed to serve Egyptian arrest warrants on the Islamists. Tensions over the Emirates' support of the Brotherhood led Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates to withdraw their ambassadors from Doha in March. Qatar has suffered a widening diplomatic rift with several of its Gulf Arab allies who consider the Muslim Brotherhood a security threat. Together with Turkey, Qatar was one of the 2 only countries still willing to openly support the Brotherhood after Egypt's current president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, assumed office in June this year. Shortly after he became president, el-Sisi ousted his predecessor, Mohammed Morsi, a leading member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and fellow Gulf Arab states showered el-Sisi with financial support, the Muslim Brotherhood became an increasingly illegitimate presence in the region. But it seems Egypt is not satisfied with the expulsion alone. A top Egyptian official told the media that the country will hunt down the exiled Muslim Brotherhood leaders and seek their arrest. It now seems that in Egypt's volatile recent history, the Muslim Brotherhood represents at least one chapter the country is keen on departing from for good.
Well, as the fighting continues in eastern Ukraine, the U.S. and NATO began a military drill with 15 other countries today. In the meantime, the Ukrainian army blames pro-Russian rebels for breaking the current truce. I-24 News correspondent Eli Ochenberg has the details.
As fighting between government forces and pro-Russian rebels rumbles on in restless East Ukraine, violating a ceasefire, a U.S.-led military exercise involving 15 countries was set to begin in Ukraine Monday. According to a statement, the 11-day drill called Rapid Trident 14 will practice peacekeeping and stability operations, including countering improvised explosive devices, convoy operations, and patrolling. It involves 200 U.S. soldiers and 1,100 troops from NATO countries and from former Soviet republics. In the meantime, heavy fighting erupted around the rebel stronghold of Donetsk in East Ukraine on Sunday, piling further pressure on the 9-day-old truce between the government and separatist fighters. Ukraine's defense spokesman accused the rebels of threatening the ceasefire by launching artillery strikes on Donetsk, killing 6 civilians. They countered that they believe Kiev is responsible for those attacks. Furthermore, observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe came under fire overnight after they got caught in the crossfire between the military and rebels.
The OSCE assesses the security situation on its route on a regular basis. There is always a remaining risk that cannot be calculated. We have been in contact throughout these 3.5 hours with both sides. We had to wait because we were in the middle of it until we found a solution to get out of that crossfire. And once we have found that solution that was safe enough for us to go out, we then took it and left.
The ceasefire is seen as a first step in efforts to draw up a long-term peace deal to end a conflict that has cost more than 2,700 lives and set off the worst crisis in East-West relations since the Cold War.
And now we'll take a look at the economy. And with me is Dr. Alex Coleman, a value creation expert at the Academic College of Tel Aviv. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
So within Israel now, the military budget is being heavily debated now.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, before the war in Gaza, it was almost clear that the budget was going to be cut. And now the question is only how much it's going to be inflated, because we're talking about money to defend against Gaza, against Dawla Islamiyah, which you have in Jordan, against Iran, which wants to fire missiles at us, and the Hezbollah in Lebanon.
No shortage of threats here.
Yes.
But is that really different than before the war this summer?
Well, because of the failure in Gaza to identify the tunnels and respond to them, and because of the fact that the armored vehicle was not armored enough and as a result burnt, budgets that seem to be potentially cut are going to be inflated dramatically. And the problem, the way I see it, is that, okay, we're going to be defended all the way through our teeth, but if you don't have education, you don't have soldiers who can operate. If you don't have health, where are these soldiers going to work if you don't have an economy?
So this will, the diversion of these funds will hurt other sectors of the economy. But how much did the war cost?
Well, okay, the war cost, there's a big argument about that in the sense that we're talking about billions of dollars. And the question is, I mean, the difficulty of costing it is because many of the costs were just regular soldiers fighting in Gaza, so that's not an additional cost. You have reserve soldiers, you have weapons, you have damage. So, but most of the money is not going to the cost of the war. Most of the money is going to the cost of the future wars. And that's the problem, the way I see it.
Is this more political than actually based on military strategy?
Well, when you think about military strategy, if you think about Napoleon, the big thing about him was that he could focus on a very small spot and achieve victory. And now we are not focusing at all. We want to be covered here, 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 and here. And as a result, there's no focus. So the budget is inflated. And the economy, which is doing quite poorly recently because of the war, because of boycotts, things like that, and needs a lot of oxygen, I think is going to be damaged. And that's a bad thing.
Well, Dr. Alex Coleman, as always, thank you for the updates.
Thank you.
Well, now, Hillary Clinton has yet to announce an official decision on running for U.S. president, but as of now, there don't appear to be too many other serious potential challengers for the Democratic nomination. Shai Ben-Ari takes a look.
When it comes to the U.S. political scene, Washington may be gearing up for this November's congressional election, but for the moment, all eyes are still focused on the biggest name being bandied about in the race for the White House, still 2 years away. At a political fundraiser in Iowa, Hillary Clinton let Democratic supporters know what's on her mind these days.
Most importantly, Bill and I are on constant grandchild watch. I'm calling Chelsea every 5 minutes to make sure things are going all right. And then, of course, there's that other thing. It is true, I am thinking about it. But for today, that is not why I'm here. I'm here for the steak.
Clinton has yet to announce an official decision on running for president, but it's clear it will be difficult for her to resist the temptation, as for now there do not appear to be any serious potential challengers for the Democratic nomination.
I am going to be making a decision around probably after the first of the year about whether I'm going to run again or not.
With the drop in President Obama's approval ratings, Hillary has been making an effort to distance herself from the White House's foreign policy. Tricky business, as she herself was in charge of that policy up until less than 2 years ago. A recent Clinton quote in which she referred to Obama's organizing principle as "don't do stupid stuff" put a strain on her relationship with the president.
Going to hug it out with the president? Absolutely. Yeah, we're looking forward to it. We have disagreements as any partners and friends, as we might very well have. But I'm proud that I served with him and for him, and I'm looking forward to seeing him tonight.
Do you think he's handling the situation in Iraq right now? I mean, would you be doing it differently?
I'm excited about signing books.
As the political season heats up in Washington, what's clear is things will soon be getting very interesting indeed.
Well, with me now is Owen Alterman, a researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies and an expert on U.S.-Israel relations, and a foreign Hillary Clinton campaign volunteer, if I have that right, Owen. So what can you tell us? Is she or is she not going to run for president?
Well, listen, I think she was just in Ohio for the steak, right? And
according to her, yes.
She heard they were having good steak. No, listen, I think the assumption in the U.S. is that she is going to run. That's what this kind of event is for. You don't actually go to this type of event for the steak. You go there because the Iowa caucuses are one of the first contests in any presidential run, and it's important to be there and to make an impression.
Now, again, it doesn't seem like there's anyone really stepping up to challenge her, even from within the party or from the Republicans. Do you see it that way?
Well, that's the interesting thing, actually. That's been the convention of wisdom in the Democratic Party for the last 2 years. But really in the last few weeks, and even on the heels of this announcement, we have started to see some people start to come forward in the Democratic Party. One of the more interesting ones is a guy named Bernie Sanders, who is a senator from Vermont, whose voice actually sounds a lot like George Steinbrenner from Seinfeld, for any Seinfeld fans out there.
I don't know if that works to his benefit or not, but all right.
Yeah, well, fair enough. But in any case, he's a senator from Vermont who actually is not a Democrat. He's an independent. But he's very far to the left in the political spectrum, the idea being that he'll challenge Hillary from the left on issues of income inequality, challenge Hillary on her connections to Wall Street, and generally try to come at this from a more progressive left-wing direction.
What about the Republicans, Owen? Who's going to step up and actually challenge whoever the Democrats put out?
Well, the race has been in flux since the demise, or at least temporary demise, of Chris Christie because of the scandals he's been facing in New Jersey.
Governor,
exactly.
Excuse me, yes.
New Jersey governor, highly popular, but facing a major scandal that's been going on for almost exactly a year over the closure of bridge lanes and the traffic that resulted. In any case, his name has been pushed to the side, and now the Republicans have an open race. One of the more interesting candidates, certainly from Israel's perspective on the Republican side, is Rand Paul, the son of Ron Paul and the inheritor of the libertarian movement and banner in the United States. And he has gained traction maybe more than anyone in the last year.
Well, thank you very much, Owen Alterman.
My pleasure.
And now wouldn't be the news today without a look at culture. And with me is I-24 News culture correspondent Shahar Peled to talk to us about some film and science, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely, David. Good evening. Well, it's the era of scientists, one might say. Scientists were once considered geeky and grey and boring even, but these days are over because last year we remember Jobs depicting the life of Steve Jobs, the technology revolutionist, and only last night the Toronto Film Festival honoured The Imitation Game, a movie of a biopic about the life of Alan Turing, the great British mathematician. It won the most prestigious award of the festival called the People's Choice Award of the Best Film, starring in it the lovely Benedict Cumberbatch. He's known from the miniseries Sherlock as Sherlock Holmes. Here he is Alan Turing. He is the World War II British mathematician who managed eventually to end World War II. He managed to break the code of the German Enigma, and many say the war ended thanks to him. He was actually the father of the computer age. He also had a very difficult personal story. He ended his life at the age of 41 after he was convicted as a homosexual. So that's very interesting all in itself.
You're making me want to see the movie now.
Absolutely. Its official release is upcoming November, so you just have to wait and see. And we can also remember that the Toronto Award is a very good Oscar indicator. So if in recent years we've seen Slumdog Millionaire and only last year's 12 Years a Slave, they won the Oscar, the Toronto Film Festival Best Film, and went on to the Academy Awards. And as we said, this film will be released this November and will be followed with yet another science hero. This time it's none other than the famous physicist Stephen Hawking. He will be, his life will be depicted in a movie called The Theory of Everything. It's based on a novel by his first wife, Jane Hawking. She actually wrote a book about their relationship before, during, and after his diagnosis with ALS, and parallel to his physics success, great worldwide renowned success. And it's very interesting to see his life this way as a young man, a healthy man, and with the disease taking on parallel to his great achievements. Very interesting anecdotes here. The younger British actor Eddie Redmayne portrays Hawking. He did an amazing research, 6 months researching his life. He met him personally, said he received a blessing from Hawking to play this role, and actually it was such a positive reaction from Hawking that he offered to lend his own voice, the very famous mechanical voice, to the film itself.
So he was involved in the making of this
in the latter part of the film, we can actually hear Hawking's electronic voice. He's a British scientist, but this is an American voice, which confused some of the people who thought he was an American scientist. He's a British, and this film depicts his life. Generally favorable reviews thus far.
Well, you've definitely piqued my interest, and I imagine many of our viewers as well. A new genre emerging now.
Absolutely.
These years. Well, Shachal, thank you very much, as always.
Thank you, David.
And now today, the city of Tel Aviv launched the 5th annual Cities Summit under the title Cracking the Innovation Code. Well, after a summer of regional violence, officials, businessmen, and entrepreneurs came to share their thoughts on the smart city. I-24 News reporter Uri Shapira went to see what they had to say.
Tel Aviv, the White City, a hectic center of art and culture. Now, officials from City Hall want to rebrand Tel Aviv as one of the most innovative high-tech cities in the world.
We are investing in Tel Aviv, and we want the world to recognize the values of the city because we want more and more people to visit it and, of course, do business in it.
We have a lot of things to learn from Tel Aviv because Tel Aviv is like the new Silicon Valley.
The city of Tel Aviv organized a special cities summit under the title Cracking the Innovation Code. Guests from international outfits such as Barcelona Smart City Expo, Berlin Airport, and Airbnb tourist website came to share ideas about technology and the smart city of tomorrow.
We have stuff like automated driving, so you will not use your own car or not have to use your own car in future, but you will be driven around by automated cabs, if you like, or the whole Internet of Things discussion that's currently going on. The production is going to change dramatically with the advent of 3D printing.
So I think cities are the platforms of the future that will create solutions for a planet that's very crowded and create solutions for it to be more sustainable and enable us to live together in a peaceful way.
Only a few weeks ago, a public gathering like this would have been unlikely, as rockets from Gaza Strip intimidated the citizens and many events and performances were cancelled. But now the originator of this summit can feel a glow of satisfaction.
I wasn't that sure a month ago, but we were very sure on having the city summit, and the end number for today is 20% more than last year. Now what we think is that innovation and entrepreneur is a real DNA of the city. That means when Tel Aviv stands out in the world, people really think that once they come here, they learn something.
A high-tech bubble in the Middle East, Tel Aviv still wants to remain an island of sanity, a center not just for innovation, but also of inspiration for other cities in the world.
And finally, a look at sports. And joining us is the host of the I-24 News Sports Weekend magazine, Maillard. Maillard, great to have you.
Good to be here.
So let's talk briefly about some basketball. It wasn't the most riveting tournament now, but tell us about it.
No, it wasn't the most riveting tournament, but the USA did achieve something they have never done before, and that's winning 2 FIBA World Cups back-to-back. This is the first time that they've ever done that, which is incredible if you think about USA basketball over the years. That this is 2014, this is the first time that they've actually done this. They destroyed Serbia 129-92. Even getting to 129 points is something we've seen in a really long time.
Who didn't they destroy? I mean, this was a wrecking ball tournament
Absolutely. They averaged 35.5 points per game, 32.5 points per game. The closest game they had the entire tournament was 21 points, and that was a win over Turkey. Unbelievable. And the thing that makes it even more surprising is this is what they were calling the USA B team that doesn't have the LeBron James, doesn't have Kevin Durant, doesn't have CP3. It's the younger guys, and they really came out here and showed we may be younger, but we just have as much talent to be able to do this. And by winning, they've won 63 international games in a row. They've signed their place into Brazil in 2016 for the Olympics. So they're going. There we'll probably see the bigger names. We'll see the LeBron James, and we'll probably also see James Harden, Kyrie Irving, who were the big guys in this
These young
tournament.
guys who made a name for themselves on the international stage. Let's get to some more pressing news, I guess
Absolutely.
I could say.
The NFL making headlines, not for the games, which is what we were also excited about yesterday. Obviously, last week, Ray Rice, the whole situation broke out again with the video being released. Adrian Peterson over the weekend.
Knocking out his wife.
Absolutely. His now wife, she was then his fiance, knocking her out cold. Absolutely horrifying video to watch. And over the weekend, Adrian Peterson being indicted for endangering a child. And this is continuing to roll and continue on with the
These
NFL.
are guys who are stars in the league, not
Absolutely,
sideline
stars
players.
to be role models for kids all over the United States, and it's something that's continuing to get the headlines, and reports are coming out today that Ray Rice may actually appeal his indefinite suspension, which is something that if the NFL even takes a look at it, we were talking about the fact that Roger Goodell may be on his way out. If they even take a look at it,
commissioner,
yeah, absolutely. If he does actually even take a look at this, if they consider it, I think there'll be people pressing for him to leave, requesting, protesting for him to be on his way out. Even more interesting thing is Rice. Adrian Peterson yesterday was left off the roster. He did not play. He was nowhere to be seen in the game versus New England, and they got their butts whooped. It was 30-7, and AP is a huge part of that team, and they need him to continue throughout the season. He may be facing 2 years jail time, but the Vikings reactivated him for next week's game. He will be playing on Sunday. Absolutely.
After the precedent we've seen set across the NFL now, where guys were even being considered for some of these crimes now are not on the field.
They're not on the field. It started with the 2-game suspension for Ray Rice when it first came out. Then the video came out with the indefinite suspensions, the Ravens cutting him. And now I'm waiting to see what the backlash from fans is. And they're hearing that Adrian Peterson, after hitting his child, coming back. Absolutely. The NFL taking extra steps, are now adding a vice president for social responsibility.
Well, we shall see. Obviously, a story that won't be over anytime soon. Maillard Severe, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for being with us. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back after another short break.